Hi folks, this is Jay, and I'm just going to answer some questions.
How do you find evangelism on the streets?
On the streets, I really enjoy it. I absolutely love it. I love talking to different people and just sharing the gospel. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he says we have a ministry of reconciliation. And it's exciting that we share this gospel that brings reconciliation, that people can come and know God and be saved.
What are the arguments that people usually put up against Christianity?
Well, the main argument that people put up against Christianity is science. They say that science trumps Christianity, but what they're doing is a fallacy called scientism. And scientism is the idea that the only knowledge worth knowing is science, which is blatantly false. And it was kind of contradicted with what is called logical positivism and the Gettier problem. And what people realised is that science assumes certain things that it cannot prove. It can't prove reality. So science doesn't encompass everything. So what you get people to realise is when we talk about love, when we talk about some of the big questions of life, like what is the meaning of life, it makes them realise that science doesn't have everything. Secondly, that the universe must have had a beginning. A lot of people say that, if there is a God, then who created God? But that's a fallacy, because creation is physical and it had to have a beginning. But God by definition is eternal. So the argument doesn't work. And also, the universe must have had a beginning, because the law of thermodynamics is everything is cooling down, and that shows it had a beginning. It shows that it's limited, the universe. And if it had a beginning, it either had to be material or immaterial. It can't be material because it had a beginning, so it has to be immaterial, and that means it must have been in something that's invisible or not physical, and that points you to God.
What spurs you on to go onto the streets?
Well, Paul says the love of Christ compels me, and it's the love of desire to see people reconciled with God. That's what compels me.
When you meet young people, do you find they have a variety of experiences of God? Have they any knowledge at all, or?
Well, it depends where you go. So in Liverpool, some people, young people, they're brought up in Catholic churches and they have some kind of Christian background. But most of the young people that we meet either have been to a Church of England school, or they've generally not had any kind of education about Christianity. So basic questions about who Jesus is, what the Bible is about, most of them don't really know much. So you have to start from the beginning and help them to understand some of the basic concepts very often.
How do you get on with the Satanists?
Well, basically, just tell them that when Christ died on the cross, Satan was crushed. One thing about Satanists, they'll say that they have their holy books, but when you actually ask them questions about them, they're very nebulous, and they don't actually give you any detail. Where with the Gospels, for example, there's lots of detail and evidence that they're historically reliable and gives us information about Jesus.
What's the difference between pagans and Satanists?
Well, pagans believe in more of the nature gods. Satanists believe in Satan himself.
Which are more common on the streets? Which group?
Well, I don't know about the same. There's quite a few paganists and quite a few Satanists around these days.
Why do the Muslims always say the Bible has been changed?
Well, they say the Bible's changed because people that teach them have said that, but actually in their own Quran, Surah 634, for example, says the Bible hasn't, the Word of God hasn't changed, and that means messengers in that context. In Islamic literature in ancient times, it wasn't a big issue. It's only an issue these days. But if you believe Jesus was just a prophet, we believe he was more than a prophet. He said, "Heaven and earth will not pass away, and my words will not pass away." And, his words will not pass away. If you read Bukhari and Muslim on Uthman, Uthman collected the manuscripts, burnt them, and made one Quran. And if that happened, which it did, then what that tells us is we don't have the original manuscripts. They were burnt, and the copies that were made were burnt. And with Christianity, the gospel, ancient texts were not burnt like that. They were copied, and they were there for everybody to see. It was an open affair, not a controlled thing like Islam. So when they say the Bible's changed, you got to look into Islam and the Quran, because the Quran is quite clear was changed right at the beginning with Uthman.
Do young Muslims apologise for ISIS? Is there?
Some Muslim young people will often try to say Islam's a religion of peace, and they'll try to skirt over and say that ISIS isn't anything to do with the Quran. But if you do study the Quran, there are at least 100 verses on jihad in the beginning, middle and end of the Quran.
What's the most difficult thing
in the Quran
that you face on the streets?
The most difficult one, I think, is this issue of gay and lesbian rights and things. We get a lot of challenges from people on this, and we don't actually. The most difficult is the anti-intellectualism on the streets, that these issues are not. There's very little rational basis for what people are saying, so they're reacting you in an emotional way. And not everybody, but often some people who bring this issue up can be very abusive, and it's very difficult to try and talk to people in a rational way when they're reacting in an emotional way and being aggressive. So I would say it's this gay and lesbian issue. And the fact is that they find it difficult to accept that the Bible teaches something opposing them in that area, but also welcoming them into a reconciliation with God to know His love and mercy and grace. But they don't seem to want that, because they want to hold on to their gay rights. And so there's a conflict there between Orthodox Christianity and this gay issue. And the young people have seemed to swallow the pill of secularism on this issue. And so it's very difficult to break down the barriers and to actually present the biblical position, because there's so much anti-intellectualism, prejudice around at the moment.
Do you meet many Christians
on the streets?
On the streets.
Yeah, we meet a few. I've had quite a few Christians come up to me and thank me for what I do. But there are some Christians also say we shouldn't be doing it, we shouldn't be preaching sin. But I question whether they're Christian or not if they're saying that. You can ask me about church planting or things like that, or preaching or pastoral care.
Can you give some examples of the pastoral care that you've had to give
recently?
Recently.
Well, I'm going to go and visit on Thursday a young man who I think needs some encouragement, who's a preacher. He needs support. I visited a gentleman who's an elderly man who's in a home. I've been visiting him regularly. I've been supporting someone who's trying to come off methadone. And we've, over the few months, some of our people have counselled people who are homeless, refugees, asylum seekers, and people who are homeless. So there's been a lot of help there. I've helped a few homeless people, brought them into the house that we have, and it's been difficult. More recently, visiting someone who's in a home at the moment who needs quite a lot of support. There's another gentleman that I have visited in the past who's gone blind, but because I've had to look after this other guy, I've not been able to see him much. So those are some